All right. Hey, everybody. Well, first things first, this is our newest series. So we are doing a review of all the Ontario Real Estate Association forms. So I'm going to be taking my time and going through all the forms, explaining all the steps. We're going to be looking at, today we're going to be looking at basically Form 100, which is the Agreement of Purchase and Sale. This is the main form that everybody negotiates on. This is how you place offer. This is how you receive offers. So we're going to go through that step by step. We're going to look at what it all means, everything that's included in it, some standard clauses that you should be aware about, and what to look out for and what to negotiate on. Okay, so I'm going to jump into it. So basically, today's date. So the agreement starts with today's date. So the agreement of purchase and sale dated this day. Today's 15th of September. We're going to have the buyer's name. You can put right? So you can put two buyers, you can put multiple buyers, you can add more and more buyers if you want. Sellers, depending on who they are. One thing to keep in mind too, there is some things, sometimes when you have a power of sale, so there will be John Doe and Jane Doe as POA, right? So that's one thing. Like if you're looking at different properties, depending on what they need and who's selling it, it'll have that, and sometimes it'll even have mortgage if it's a bank foreclosure and stuff like that. So it'll say the person's name there or the mortgage trustee. Then you have the address, right? So the address gets filled out, fronting on the side of blank. So this is the street, right? So what street is it fronting on in the city, municipality, district, or township of. So you're gonna put Ottawa here for an Ottawa, and having a frontage of such and such feet or meters. So if it's a townhouse, you're probably gonna see something like 30 feet by 100 feet deep, right? More or less, and legally described as. The legal description is going to be in your real estate agent will be able to pull up the legal description. It will be pre-loaded on their side of the MLS, so they'll have it in their MLS listing, or if they need to look it up, they can go through Geo Warehouse and look up the legal description. This is exactly the property that you're buying. So for homes, like regular homes that you're buying in the city, this isn't going to matter a whole much. I mean, it'll all be general info. It won't be like anything specific. But if you're buying rural properties, this is where you need to know exactly what the legal description is, or else that could cause some issues, right? Again, but that's just detailing the property, what it is, what you're buying, including its easements and not described elsewhere, right? So you want to make sure that's there in there. Your purchase price, right? So anywhere, any price, right? You can put in here, and then it has to be filled out. So let's say we type in 650,000 for an agent. It'll auto populate here. So let's say 650,000. Then you have your deposit. This one is important, and this is negotiable, right? So this is herewith upon acceptance or as otherwise described in the agreement. So herewith is when you offer the deposit with the offer, right? So back in COVID days, some people were doing deposits herewith. So they were saying, okay, here's my offer of 650,000. I have herewith with the offer, I have a copy of the check that's ready to be deposited into the account. So that's herewith, right? Upon acceptance is once the offer is accepted, right? This is also going to tie into another clause when we're going to scroll down below and we're going to look at deposit. If you have upon acceptance is 24 hours within the accepted time period. If you miss that, the contract is technically null and void, right? So keep this in mind. I know we have a lot of e-transfers abilities and stuff like that. You can do things electronically, but it doesn't matter. So I had a deal where it actually kind of went sideways from the seller side. The seller decided not even to want to sell anymore. And because the deposit was done by multiple e-transfers, so I think it was like a $5,000 deposit. The limits are $3,000 per day. So they deposited $2,500 and $2,500 the next day. So within 48 hours, but they put it in upon acceptance. The seller didn't like the contract anymore. He decided to cancel, spoke to his lawyer, and they said, well, we have proof of the deposits, and the deposits came in within 48 hours, not 24 hours. So they were actually able to get away from that deal. So keep that in mind. If it's upon acceptance, if you don't put in as otherwise described, so if you have trouble getting to to the bank or getting access to your funds, you need to put as otherwise described in this agreement, and that'll be part of your negotiations as well, right? So if you need time to get to a bank, or if it is a long weekend and you're putting a large deposit that you can't just transfer electronically, you need to put this in, and you need to state. Typically, what I like to say is, we'll look at the Schedule A basically, but in the Schedule A, you want to put in deposit shall be deposited by the buyer within 48 hours or before, Sunday the 25th by 5 p.m., whatever, right? Doesn't matter the date, but just pick the right date that makes sense for what you're putting in. So this is the deposit. So if I type in, let's say $10,000 deposit, and it's going to go to eXp Realty Inc. or in trust, sorry, pardon me. So we're going to put in trust. You always want to put in trust because it's a trust account. This is a by negotiable check payable to eXp Realty and Trust, deposit holder to be held in trust pending completion or other termination of this agreement, and to be credited toward the purchase price and on completion. For the purpose of this agreement, upon acceptance shall mean that the buyer is required to deliver the deposit to the deposit holder within 24 hours of acceptance on this agreement. The parties to this agreement hereby acknowledge that, unless otherwise provided in this agreement, the deposit holder shall place the deposit in trust in the deposit holder's non-interest bearing real estate trust account, and no interest shall be earned, received, or paid on the deposit. So there's your 24 hours of acceptance. So that means if you don't do it within 24 hours, it's null and void. The second part, a lot of real estate companies do have real estate trust accounts that are interest bearing. If they are, they will have a Schedule B. For example, my brokerage has an interest-bearing trust account, which which the buyer would be eligible for their interest earned, and it would be a schedule. We call it, our schedule is a B1. So we would add a comma and put B1 because that's an additional schedule. Let's say you have a property that has a Schedule B where they have as is clauses, right? Or you're buying a bank foreclosure and they have a list of clauses that the bank needs. So they'll put, Schedule B. You could put Schedule B1, put Schedule C, right? And this could come in. This could come in from the selling side, right? So, but for the purpose of this, we'll just ignore that. But keep that in mind. Schedule B's, Schedule C's, Schedule S's, all that stuff can be added in there, but you need to note them in there. Irrevocability. So a lot of people don't know what irrevocability means. It's basically how long is the offer irrevocable by me. So if I'm making an offer, I'm the buyer, right? So the buyer is giving their irrevocability. A lot of people think it's reversed, right? So the offers irrevocable by the seller. But it's actually, if you're the buyer, you want to make it irrevocable, and let's say you want to give them till 9 p.m. and we're going to do it tonight. So we're making an offer today and we're going to do it by 9 p.m. is when we want to get an answer from. The irrevocability is basically how long you're making your offer valid for, right? Some people will put shorter vocables to give quote unquote a bully offer, but that has to be a pretty strong offer, right? For them to ignore, depending on what they have stated in the MLS. So before, what they did during COVID, there was they were presenting offers on this date by 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. or 1 p.m., whatever it was, right? What a bully offer in that case would be, okay, we're giving you 12 hours, or we're giving you 5 hours that our offer is valid for. Let's call it was a bully offer. A real bully offer would be probably like something like 4 or 5 hours during the peak of COVID. So they would say, okay, we're giving you till today. We're actually paying you the most aggressive price, and whatever. Here's our bully offer. Let us know if you'd like to consider it. All right. Now, if you're dealing with a bank sale, they're probably going to ask for 48 hours, 24 hours irrevocable. So that means you're the buyer. So you have to give. So let's say it's 4:52 right now. So you want to give until the 16th, and let's call it 5 p.m. 5 p.m. irrevocable, and that's that, right? This stuff also gets negotiated. So let's say you're the seller and you don't accept this offer of 650,000. You're going to scratch out that number of 650. You're going to put the number you like, and then you're going to change it to seller irrevocability, and you're going to give them till whatever time. So let's say it's the next day, you're countering back, you're going to put, irrevocable until 9 p.m. That means that the seller is giving their irrevocability. So that means you as a seller are tied into this offer. That means the buyer has all the control. Even if you get an offer that's way higher than this one, it doesn't matter. They have until 9 p.m. to accept this offer. And if they don't, that's when you have the ability to accept other offers. as a seller. Completion date. So completion date, the agreement shall be completed by no later than 6 p.m. So 6 p.m. is a standard time. So basically, if you're closing, let's say we have a September 30th closing. Completion dates also cannot be on any holidays, and they can't be on Saturdays and Sundays. So it has to be on a day the bank is open. Keep in mind, you don't want to be closing typically on a Friday or a Monday, because if a deal is coming close and it doesn't close on the Friday, it's closing on the Monday then. And that could be potential days, that extra days that you're accruing interest on from the sale. So let's say if you're buying the property and you put September 31st closing or October 31st closing, right? Something happens, the bank messed up some paperwork or whatever the issue is. There was an issue somewhere and you weren't able to close on the 31st and you had to close on the 3rd of October or 3rd of November. So what would happen is the seller, because you weren't able to close, is probably going to send you the cost of their holdings, right? So what did it cost them to uphold the property for those 2 days, whatever, 3 days? Still might be minimal, but it's still something you got to keep in mind. So I always like having closings on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or Thursdays. That way it gives you a grace period either end. You don't want to close on a Monday, because Monday's first day after the weekend, so you don't know. It just makes sense to do it Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, and they put 6 p.m. because they don't know when they're gonna get the exact moment of the funds. It could close sooner than 6 p.m., but typically I always give a lot of my clients a range between 12 and 6 p.m. I haven't seen deals close very early, so typically between 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. is when you're going to get the keys. Upon completion, vacant possession of the property shall be given to the buyer unless otherwise described in this agreement. So then everybody will put their initial there and initial of sellers. Then we go to the second page. So notices the seller hereby appoints the listing brokerage as agent for the seller for the purpose of giving and receiving notices pursuant to this agreement, where a buyer's brokerage has entered into a representation agreement with the buyer. The buyer hereby appoints the buyer's brokerage as agent for the purpose of giving and receiving notices. So basically, you're allowing the agents to do their job. You're allowing them to give each other notices. So let's say we have conditions due. You're agreeing that, fax or email, you're going to be communicating like that, and that's where my email would go, and the other agent's email would go as well. Chattels included. So chattels is basically all your fixtures, your appliances, all that stuff. So anything you want to include in there, put it in there. If you see, I always like to put in blinds and window coverings if they are in fact like drilled in and stuff like that. It can be misconstrued, so you want to make sure that everything that you're putting in there is included. If the home is vacant, there's not going to be much. It's going to be basically stove, dishwasher, washer, dryer, and then whatever curtains are there if you want them. If you don't want them, you can exclude them here, right? If there's things that you don't want, like that, this is all negotiations too, right? So let's say there's a hot tub and the sellers have it as an inclusion, but you don't want it and you don't want to deal with it and you don't know what kind of state it's in. So you put hot tub excluded. Because if it's open, if you don't put it in here and you don't put it in here and the hot tub is just left there, there's no recourse for them to really go back to you on and say, well, you didn't want the hot tub excluded, so you didn't say that, so we just left it. We don't care, right? So those things, like, you want to make sure you're going over and you're going through the pictures on what things you want and you don't want. Typically, most people won't include sofas and items like that. Like personal items typically aren't included, but I've seen people negotiate all sorts of things. So like if there's something that you really want that fits the house, I'd say try and negotiate it in. If it's a family heirloom of the seller or they have a personal attachment to it, they might not be willing to part with it. But again, you never know. But things like gazebos, pergolas, sheds, if you're in the rural properties, if they have a ride-on lawnmower that they have in the garage and you don't put it in here, it's not staying, right? Same thing here. Like I said, the hot tub was one example, but if there's a bunch of junk in the garage, you got to put it in there, right? Leftover planks of wood in the garage excluded. I always like it. Again, you want to just put it in there just so it's super clear. That's the main thing there. Rental items, so including lease to own. So if you have equipment, so typically most hot water tanks in Ottawa, like on newer homes, are leased items or rental items. So you would put that in there. So we put hot water tank. Now, you want to be careful. You want to make sure that your agent is checking the listing to see what is a rental item. Because basically, if they are not listed in there, and you just click one, right? So let's give an example, right? So let's say the furnace, the air conditioning, and the hot water tank are all rentals. In the listing, they have it listed as all rentals. And then you didn't know that, you blindly signed the contract, and it says here hot water tank, furnace, and air conditioning, right? So it says that. Now you have a incoming bill of whatever it costs. So it could be about $150 a month that you're renting these items for, and they're not owned by you. So keep that in mind. And if they're items that you want to be bought out, you take this out and then you would put it into the chattels, right? And you would also, on top of that, you would also add it into the Schedule A, seller to pay out remaining amount for rental items, and you would list the rental items. So that is one thing to keep in mind. HST, so we'll go to the next one. HST is if the sale of the property, real estate property described above, is subject to harmonized sale tax. So typically for a resale home, this will just be included in. If it's a brand new build, it will typically say in addition to, but depending on the builder, depending on how they have their contracts done, it will say in addition to or included in. It's all subjective. But yeah, keep that in mind. If you're buying a resale, you always want to make sure this is clicked as included in. You don't want to be paying extra taxes for no reason. In addition, initial of the buyer, initial of the seller, and off you go. Title search date. This is 2 weeks before closing. So let's say we had our closing of October 31st or October 30th, call it, because we want to close on a Thursday. So we would do 2 weeks before that. So that's the 16th of October. This is where this is the requisition date. So your lawyer is sending a requisition to the seller's lawyer. So to examine title to the property at buyer's own expense and until the earlier of 30 days from the later of the requisition date on which the conditions in this agreement are fulfilled. So work orders or deficiencies affecting the property and that its present use is. So if you're buying a residential property, you want to put residential, right? If you're buying a condo, I always put residential condo, maybe lawfully continued and principal building, maybe insured against risk of fire. Seller hereby consents to the municipality, other government and agencies. Yeah, so that will go there. Future use. The seller and buyer agree that there is no representation or warranty of any kind that future intended use of the property by buyer is or will be lawful except as may be specifically provided in this agreement. So future use, there's no representation or warranty. So if you're changing the use of it, so if it's a residential property and it's turning into a multi-residential dwelling, we can't guarantee that, right? So that's what that is. Anything that you see here, you have to put, if it's going to be crossed out, you want to make sure that you're putting an addition in the Schedule A. So title, provided that the title to the property is good and free from all registrations, restrictions, charges, liens, and encumbrances, except as otherwise specifically provided in this agreement, and save and except for any registered restrictions or covenants that run with the land. So this is what your lawyer is really going to be going through. This is what you want to do your due diligence on. They'll advise you this stuff during the title search date. Closing arrangements, where each of the seller and buyer retain a lawyer to complete the purchase of sale agreement. So basically, again, closing arrangements, so everything's going to be done with the lawyers. Documents and discharge, buyer shall not call for the production of any title deed, abstract, survey. Again, all this stuff can be done. You just have to, whatever you don't like in here, you have to put in a Schedule A and cross out here. Inspection. So this is basically, if you're doing a firm offer with no conditions, you're agreeing to all these terms. So buyer acknowledges having had the opportunity to inspect the property, understands that upon acceptance of this offer, there shall be a binding agreement of purchase and sale between the buyer and seller. The buyer acknowledges having opportunity to include a requirement for a property inspection in this agreement and agrees that except as may be specifically provided for in this agreement, the buyer will not be obtaining a property inspection or property inspection report regarding the property. So if you don't put any conditions like we did here, So let's say we didn't have the inspection condition, this guy here, you would be putting in an offer without an inspection condition, and you can't go back to the seller based on any findings. Let's say you do a walkthrough and you find issues, you can't do anything about it because you accepted this agreement here. But this is superseded because of the Schedule A, right? Put in that Schedule A for a reason. So it supersedes that. Insurance, all buildings and property, all buildings on the property and all other things being purchased shall be and remain until completion at risk of the seller. So basically, anything that's on the property needs to be maintained. If it's not maintained and it's not insured, the seller is taking risk on it. So let's say the property is vacant, they take off insurance and they turn off their water, and there's issues with the property and everything malfunctions. It's on the seller before closing, right? So that's why these are all terms that go to both sides. Planning Act. This agreement shall be effective to create an interest in the property only if seller complies with the subdivision control provision of the Planning Act by completion, and seller covenants to proceed diligently at seller's expense to obtain any necessary consent by completion. So basically, you're adhering to the Planning Act as a seller. Documentation preparation. The transfer / deed shall, save for the landlord transfer tax affidavit, be prepared in registration form at the expense of the seller, and any charge / mortgage to be given back to the buyer to seller at the expense of the buyer. If requested by buyer, seller covenants that the transfer deed to be delivered on completion shall contain the statements completed by Section 5022 of the Planning Act. So documentation preparation, so any chargeback mortgages. This, again, a lot of lawyer legal language. It's hard to read, but that's why we're reviewing it. A lot of this stuff, if you really want to know what you're getting in for, have a lawyer on standby. They can go through all these documents with you to really go knee deep. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't give advice. I just want to review this whole thing so you know what you're getting yourself into. But if you want a lawyer to explain this by detail, we have tons of lawyers that we can refer to you, and they will go through this simply and just know what to expect, right? Residency, so subject to B, below, the seller represents and warns that the seller is not, and on completion will not be a non-resident under the non-residency provisions of the income tax. So basically, non-resident income tax, which representation and warranty shall survive and not merge upon completion of this transaction, and the seller shall deliver to the buyer a statutory declaration that the seller is not then a non-resident of Canada, provided that if the seller is a non-resident under the non-residency provisions of the income side, the buyer shall be credited towards the purchase price with the amount, if any. So basically, if the seller is a non-resident and the buyer is charged non-residency tax, they go after the seller and they would be reimbursed. Adjustments: any rents, mortgage interest, realty tax included, local improvement rates, and unmetered public or private utility charges and unmetered cost of fuel as applicable shall be apportioned and allowed to the day of the completion itself to be proportionate to the buyer. So basically, let's say if you're buying a rental property, any rents would go to the buyer, right? But also any mortgage interest charges, any realty tax. So this is kind of like like if you have property tax, let's say for example, you have property tax for the year and you're one of those people that doesn't pay it on a yearly basis, but instead you pay it per month, or vice versa, right? Let's say you paid it for the year. As a seller, you paid it for the year, you sold it in September, and you still have 3 months left of property tax that you're owed back. So basically the buyer you'd have a charge back going back to the seller of the difference. And vice versa, if you didn't pay any property tax as a seller, and the buyer takes it over, you would be owed the difference of what would be needed, right? Adjustments, property assessments. The buyer and seller hereby acknowledge that the province of Ontario has implemented current value assessments and properties may be reassessed on an annual basis. The buyer and seller agree that no claim will be made against the buyer or seller or any broker or salesperson for any charges in property tax as a result of reassessment of the property, save and accept any property tax that accrued prior to the completion of this transaction. So basically, if the property goes up in value and there's a reassessment and the property taxes go up, you can't go after anybody. which is pretty simple, right? Properties get reassessed pretty much every year or every couple of years, but assessments change often. So keep an eye on it. Something you want to know, but it's nothing that you can control because the government's going to do what the government does. Time limits. The time shall, in all respects, be the essence hereof, provided that the time for doing or completing of any matter provided for herein may be extended or abridged by an agreement in writing by the signed seller and buyer or their respective lawyers who may specifically authorized in that agreement. So this is like the times are set, and if you need to adjust them, they need to be put on an amendment. Tender. Any tender of documents or money hereunder may be made upon seller or buyer or their respective lawyers on the day set for completion. Money shall be tendered with funds drawn on a lawyer's trust account in the form of a bank draft, certified check, or wire transfer using the link's high value payment system as set out and prescribed by the Canadian Payments Act, as amended from time to time. So typically the tender. So what you would do is if you're giving $100,000 down payment, you're gonna go to your bank, get a bank draft for the amount that you have saved up, plus whatever your lawyer fees are. Your lawyer is gonna give you a total of what you owe. You give your bank draft to the lawyer. That's your down payment. They combine that with the mortgage documents and they send that in together. They pay the bank, they pay the seller, and everything's good. And that's your tender. Family Law Act. So seller warns that spousal consent is not necessary to this transaction under the provisions of Family Law Act, unless the spouse of the seller has executed the consent herein after provided. So spousal consent, you want to make sure if the spousal consent is needed, make sure that it is in there, right? UFI, the seller represents and warns of the buyer that during the time seller has owned the property, the seller has not caused any building on the property to be insulated with insulation containing urea formaldehyde, and that's to the best of the seller's knowledge. No building on the property contains or has ever contained insulation that contains urea formaldehyde. So this is basically formaldehyde. So this is a what do you call it? Basically, it's no longer used, but you can't be using insulation or anything like that contains urea formaldehyde. This warranty shall survive and not merge on the completion of this transaction. And if the building is part of a multi-unit building, this warranty shall only apply to that part of the building which is subject to this transaction. So basically, if it contains that and the seller didn't tell you about it, they need to tell you about it. The way they tell you about it is if you make an offer and they don't accept your offer and they cross this out, that means there's urea formaldehyde in the property, right? But typically they will just tell you on the listing that it does contain that, like not on the actual listing itself, but they'll probably have it in the notes of the property for the agents to understand. Legal, accounting, and environmental advice. The parties acknowledge. Oh, by the way, sorry, I'll go back to the UFI, the urea formaldehyde. So that part, just because it has it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You just want to make sure it's not a newer property. Like typically properties from the 1950s, 1940s, whatever, something that's super old will probably have that. It can be remediated. Some people don't because it's a lot of money, but also it's only disturbed if you disturb the product itself. So if you're not touching anything, it doesn't need to be disturbed. It's actually going to be fine. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to give you advice on this. Talk to a lawyer and talk to building inspectors about UFI. That is important. But if you're looking at homes in the early 2000s, late 90s, you're probably not going to run into any home with this issue. Legal, accounting, and environmental advice. So the parties acknowledge that any information provided by the brokerage is not legal, tax, or environmental advice. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Consumer reports. The buyer is hereby notified that a consumer report containing credit and or personal information may be referred to in connection with this transaction. So consumer reports, just confirming that the buyer is hereby notified that a consumer report containing may be referred to in connection with this transaction, right? So if somebody is going through a consumer proposal, they might be notified that consumer report credit rating, right? So agreement in writing. If there's a conflict or discrepancy between any provision added in this agreement, including on any schedule attached here too. So we talked about schedules, so anything that's conflicting, and any provision in the standard preset portion hereof, the added provision shall supersede the agreement. So basically, let's say we have an agreement and we make a change to it, we're adding an amendment. The amendment is what supersedes that. This agreement shall be read with all changes of gender or number required by context. Electronic signatures. So typically, again, everybody's using electronic signatures, so you're just confirming that you're okay with that. Initial, time and date. Any reference to a time and date in this agreement shall mean the time and date where the property is located. Successors and assigns. The heirs, executors, administrators, successors, and assigns of the undersigned are bound by the terms herein. Okay. Self-explanatory there. So basically, you would put. So this is your signature: buyer, seller. And then if it's accepted, this is what they're putting in. So if your irrevocability is 5 p.m., the sellers have to accept and put a timestamp here that it's been accepted before 5 p.m. So let's say we're accepting today. DigiSign would actually have an auto timestamp, which is preferred. If you're signing in person, then your agent would print this out for you, bring it to you. You'd sign it and you'd write the time. Taking a picture of the document also helps because that would be time stamped as well. Information on the brokerages. Oh yeah, and then you got to put your signature here. This acceptance also goes two ways, right? So let's say you make an offer as a buyer. The seller looks at it. They say, you know what? We don't like the price. We're going to counter offer you at $660. Right now you're the buyer. Now you're the one that has to accept. So as a buyer, you would be putting the acceptance in there. So you would sign here, and you would be the one putting this timestamp. So it goes both ways. There's not just one party that can only accept. Listing brokerage info, right? So eXp Realty, that's our brokerage. I would put my name here. You know, whoever is coming in as the co-op, which is the buying brokerage, who's representing the buyer. Acknowledgement. So I acknowledge receipt of my signed copy of this agreement of purchase and sale, and I authorize the brokerage to forward a copy to my lawyer. So you're allowing us to send it to your lawyer. Commission trust agreement. So the commission trust to cooperating brokerage shown on the foregoing agreement of purchase and sale. So basically, you're agreeing that there's going to be commission trust. Buyer, seller. So this is the Schedule A. So this one is where we go to all the main stuff. So the buyer agrees to pay the balance of the purchase price subject to adjustments to the seller on the completion of this transaction with funds drawn on the lawyer's trust account in the form of a bank draft, certified check, or wire transfer using the large value transfer system. Okay. Then you have your conditions. This offer is conditional upon the following: the buyer arranging at the buyer's own expense a new first charge / mortgage satisfactory to the buyer in the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. B, the inspection of the property by a home inspector at the buyer's own expense. Again, so a lot of these conditions, if you're a buyer, you're going to be putting in at the buyer's expense because you're in your sole and absolute discretion. So they're at your expense, but then you're in your own sole and absolute discretion. So you don't, if you're giving a reason to somebody why you're walking away from a deal, you actually don't have to describe the reason. So here, the way this is written, the inspection of subject property by a home inspector at the buyer's own expense and the obtaining of a report satisfactory to the buyer and in the buyer's sole and absolute discretion, the seller agrees to cooperate in providing access to the property for the purpose of this inspection. So buyer's sole and absolute discretion. I can go look at the property. I don't even, I can bring a home inspector, and let's say they tell me the windows are no good. I don't have to give any proof. I can just say I'm walking away from the property. The reason is home inspection. What happened to the home inspection? I prefer not to say. I'm just walking away. That is all that's needed, and that's the way the clauses work. As a seller, it sucks. Some buyers do act like that, but a reasonable buyer will tell you, hey, we're a little bit scared off by the property. We knew going into it there was some work, but we weren't expecting such and such, right? And then the seller can say, okay, you know what? Do you want us to? Should we renegotiate a few things? We didn't know about that either, or hey, we knew about that. That is something that was already, told to you. But realistically, there's nothing you can do if somebody gets cold feet because of an inspection. You can't do anything about that. Same thing with the mortgage, right? If they don't get approved for A lending or B, they can't get B lending and they need to go private lending, and they don't want to go that route, even though the inspection was fine, they don't have to proceed. It's all in their sole and absolute discretion. So keep that in mind. There's other clauses too that we put in. So lawyer review clause, that's typically for condo purchases, because you want to have the lawyer review the status certificate. You can also put a lawyer review clause in reverse. So let's say you're a seller, you get this offer, you see this, you see that there's conditions, you don't know what you want to do with it, and you need to have your lawyer review it. What you would put in is that condition, but say it's conditional upon the seller's sole and absolute discretion, reviewing it by a lawyer, and you give a couple days, whatever, to have it reviewed. So those are conditions. We can go into more detail about conditions, because there's lots and lots of conditions, and every property is different, because we can do so many different things in terms of conditions for tenanted properties, rural properties, multi-unit properties. There's so many different things. So let's, like, if you guys have questions or want to know what conditions to use on a certain property, these are the standard two that you'll see on most residential homes. But if we're looking at different properties, there's lots of different due diligences that we can do. In addition to any other provision in this agreement, the seller will act as property to the buyer's lender or appraiser in the event that the appraisal is required any time prior to the completion date. Pretty standard. These are all my standard clauses. I always put this stuff in here. The seller represents and warrants that the chattels and fixtures as included in this agreement of purchase and sale will be in good working order and free from all liens and encumbrances on completion. The parties agree that this representation and warranty shall survive and not merge on completion of this transaction, but only apply to the state of the property at completion of this transaction. So, a lot of legal language, but this is to protect the buyer. So make sure the seller represents and warrants that the chattels and fixtures are as included in this agreement will be in good working order and free from all liens. So there'll be no liens on it, and they're in good working order. So you get two walkthroughs. We're gonna go to the walkthroughs. So where's the walkthroughs? I didn't add them in here, but that's because I have them in here. Here it is. I just didn't copy the bottom part. This is always preloaded, so I would never miss it. Trust me. So the buyer shall have the right to view the property 2 times prior to the date of completion at a mutually agreed upon time, provided that the written notice is given to the seller. Seller agrees to provide access to the property for the purpose of this viewing. So you do 2 viewings, right? You do one, you go check out the house, you go take measurements, you go do your thing, all that stuff. That's the exciting part, right? Now, you always save 1 walkthrough, so you can always adjust this too. If you want 3 walkthroughs, 4 walkthroughs, you want 1 walkthrough, you don't care, right? You can do all these different things, but I always say keep 1 walkthrough for either a day before closing, a couple of days before closing, and make sure you get in there and check all the chattels and make sure everything works. If it doesn't work, you tell your lawyer. Your lawyer will then do probably a holdback for a certain amount. Hey, Mr. Seller, we checked out the property. There is an issue. We will be closing on it, but we're doing a holdback of such amount to make up for the fact that we saw that the dishwasher wasn't working, or the washer wasn't working, or we saw one of the kitchen sinks is broken. We saw a window is broken. So that makes them fix it without getting their money, or in reverse, if they don't want to fix it, then you get reimbursed for it because the money's already been withheld. Notwithstanding the child's excluded and included previously in this agreement of purchase and sale, the real property shall also include the following appurtenances and fixtures: storm, screens, sash and doors, all electric light fixtures and ceiling fans were installed, all drapery tracks and rods as installed, all windows, blinds, all that stuff. So anyways, it goes through all this stuff. I put it in there. It often gets crossed out, but this protects you from missing out on any of these items. The reason why I put this in there is because we don't know. But this makes it clear as day that everything is included the way it is. So if somebody likes their smoke detectors and wants to bring them, and they just bought brand new ones and they can't take them out, right? Bathroom vanities, they just renovated the place and they're mad about the sale because they didn't get the number that they wanted, so they start taking and removing items. Well, this will protect you. Seller represents a warrant that the property is not, and on completion date will not be subject to the City of Ottawa vacant unit tax. Sorry, so protects you against the vacant unit tax. So even if you do get charged it because of the previous owner, this protects you there. The seller and buyer agree that the vacant unit tax pertaining to the seller's ownership of the property shall be borne solely by the seller. Subject. Okay, so this is prohibition of the purchase and sale. Okay, the buyer represents and warns that of the prohibition of purchase of residential property by non-Canadians Act. So this is just making sure that you're Canadian. The buyer shall have the right to view the property 2 more times. The seller agrees to deliver the real property to the buyer on closing in the same condition with no alterations at the same time. Sorry, at the time of the agreement to purchase sale, and that the property will be left empty unless otherwise agreed upon, and broom clean. So broom swept condition. So you always want to have that. There's a lot of important clauses in here, and that's why we have the Schedule A, because it supersedes everything and it protects you. If you're adding anything, you can do multiple pages of this. You can, if you want to have more and more stuff, you can add a Schedule B with a blank page and just write out all your clauses. But so far, I've reviewed it. We've gone through everything. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to upload this and let's review it together. If you have questions, let me know, comment, and we'll go from there. The next few pages, I'm going to go through the next few forms that I'm going to go through. We have a lot. So we have the RECO information guide, we have the confirmation of cooperation, we have agreement to leases, agreement to buyer representation agreements, seller representation agreements. We're going to go through all that, and I'm going to make them all listed out one by one so you can see exactly which form you need to click on. I'm going to put the chapters so you can go line by line to find what info you need. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much. Happy day.